And joining us now on the debate for the full hour tonight, in London, UK, Jonathan Birdwell, researcher at Demos, a British think tank. In our nation's capital, Michel Junot-Katsuya, former CSIS operative and a security and intelligence specialist for the Northgate Group. And here in studio, Imam Sheikh Youssef Badat, the Imam at the Islamic Foundation of Toronto. Mohammed Abdullahi Mohammed, a Canadian who has fought alongside the Al-Qaeda-linked Somali militia Al-Shabaab, and he's now founder of Generation Islam, a new organization seeking to combat youth radicalization here in Toronto. And finally, Mubin Sheikh, former CSIS undercover informant in the Toronto 18 terror case. Let me welcome everybody, both here in the studio and in Points Beyond, to our program tonight about a very important topic that I know has many Canadians extremely concerned. And just before we start, let's bring up the following graphics just to give people a sense about the history behind some of the discussion we're going to be having tonight. So, Michael, if you would, let's bring these up. Canadians arrested under the anti-terrorism laws of this country since 2003. Project Samosit's the one we've heard about so much recently. 3 people arrested, all Canadian citizens, 1 born in Canada. Let us remind everybody as we sit here tonight that none of these charges in this case has yet been proved in a court of law, but these are the allegations. We remember well a few years ago the Toronto 18 case, 18 arrested in 2006, 11 found guilty, charges against 7 stayed or dropped, all but 1 born and or raised in Canada. And Momin Khawaja, arrested in 2004, convicted in 2008, sentenced to 10.5 years in prison, again born and raised in Canada. Imam, I think I want to start with you tonight. The arrests in Ottawa and in London in August have surprised many people because of the profiles of those involved. Educated, employed, middle class, seemingly very connected with their communities. Lots of people in this country, I suspect, were very surprised at those profiles. Were you surprised?
Yes, definitely. It's always disturbing when we see people who have a certain type of dissent or dissatisfaction with an issue. And then this thought process turns or transforms into something that is violent or something that is regarded as criminal. We saw this during the G20. Freedom of speech, freedom of expression. Many people didn't agree with many decisions of the political G20 leaders. However, when we saw them in the Toronto downtown streets, we saw them engaged, as Chief Bill Blair alluded to in his report, terrorist activity. So similar is the case with these youngsters who have allegedly been given this allegation regarding terrorism. So it's a shock when we hear that people are engaging in these type of activities or planning or plotting these type of activities.
Mubin, let me ask you the same question. Were you surprised when you heard the news out of Ottawa?
No, I'm not surprised. I'm going to say that it's probably on the basis of my work experience, that not to really fall into the category of assuming anything, leave the door open for anything. And I look at my own self. I went through a period of radicalization my own self. So I can look back to my own personal history and see that this is something that develops as a natural progression on the spectrum, especially when we're dealing with immigrant families, first generation born, the push and pulls between different cultures. So.
A natural progression. We're going to get into that in a second because that's an interesting way to put it. Mohammed, how about you? Were you surprised?
First of all, I want to say Assalamu alaikum to all the Muslims, Canadians who are watching, and the rest of the Canadians. On the other hand...
and a happy Ramadan to everybody as well.
And happy Ramadan, as we are celebrating the last 48 hours of Ramadan. Was I surprised? First of all, as a legally trained, I was taught to be to believe the alleged allegations, basically to give them presumption of innocence to the people that were the 3. And the way that was handled is different, but was I suspecting that to happen? I have no doubt that I didn't suspect that it would not happen. I suspect it would happen again and again and again.
You are not surprised to hear that people who are part of their communities, dads, Canadian Idol contestants, no surprise that people who seem quite blessedly normal are being accused of what they're being accused of.
No surprise at all, because we live in a country that we have Canada, one young Muslim and one non-Muslim. As being said before in the United States, one black, one white. That's the Americas that we live. The Canada I lived, that I grew up with, was one Muslim and non-Muslim community.
Okay. Michel Junot-Katsoya, let me go to you in Ottawa and get your take on this. What do you say?
Well, from a law enforcement and intelligence point of view, we're not surprised because we know that there is a lot of activities in Canada. Are we worse or better than other countries? We're not necessarily worse, but we do have a problem. So it's always disappointing when there is realization or concretization. This is revealed concretely to us, but it is a challenge. It is a challenge for our society, and it did not come as a total surprise to me, unfortunately, no.
Jonathan Birdwell, you have experience with this over on the other side of the pond, if we can put it that way. How about you? How about in England? When news of this kind comes forward, what's the reaction?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily surprising, their backgrounds, because I think all the research shows that there's no such thing as a typical terrorist profile. There's no such thing as a typical terrorist progression or progression to violence. There's always going to be an exception to the rule. So, you know, in that sense, I don't think it's surprising.
Shouldn't it be? Should we not be shocked when these kinds of allegations surround people who we think of as being, quote unquote, blessedly normal middle-class people? Jonathan, you want to take a second kick at that?
Well, I mean, yes, I think to some extent we shouldn't expect this to happen all over the place. I mean, but to say that you know, one instance is going to be a complete surprise, I think what it really shows, and again, as you said, you know, the allegations at this point are not proven, but if they are, I think it just says is that Canada's not immune to this threat. It's the same in countries throughout the West and throughout the world. Everyone's facing this threat, and you know, I think in Canada, our research shows that to some extent it is less of a threat than it is, say, in the UK. But obviously, I'm not in as well a position as then to say that as opposed to security services. So.
Now, I understand. All right, Mubin, let me follow up with you, because you did mention in your first answer that you thought this was a, quote, natural progression for some people. Tell me what you mean by that.
Yeah, I think the environment in which we're seeing these kinds of these offenses occur, these activities being undertaken. Again, I look back to my own history. When you have people who come, immigrant families coming from wherever it is, India, Pakistan, let's kind of pick on those regions. Like I come from an Indo-Pak background, and you know, my parents are a little less conservative, but looking at the other people around me whose parents were very conservative, when you're now born and raised in Toronto, Canada, you're going to public school 8 hours a day, you're not seeing your parents, you're not exposed to that culture, you're exposed to a totally different and opposite culture, one would say. And then what happens is you really start to have an identity crisis. And perhaps Jonathan will allude to this, but I think a lot of people do see that, and I experienced that there was an identity crisis. You don't know which way you're supposed to go. You're expected to be one way, but you're taught, you know, your nurture is supposed to be another way. Society is telling you, no, you got to be like this. So I think the intense conflict between those things, and it's a very intense conflict, because we're dealing with a generation that's really right at the line, first, second generation. So to me, it's not that surprising that these kinds of anomalies of behavior start to occur.
But Mohammed, it's one thing to, I appreciate his point about these two cultures being in conflict. It's one thing to be living with that conflict. It's another thing to say, as in the case of the Toronto 18, I'm so conflicted I want to go behead the Prime Minister of the country I was now born in. Explain that to us.
From my perspective, from the Somali youth that I deal with, most of them are focused in going back to Somalia, not focused in here. Most of them, the guys I've seen.
Even if they're born here?
Even if the ones who are born here, who has never been to Somalia, has never seen Somalia. One thing that Somalis are different than the Pakistanis and the Indian community is we speak the same language, we have the same religion, we have the same ethnicity. And we are a very young, vibrant Canadian. We just started moving to Canada in the late 80s. And can you imagine, we have about 300,000 Somali Canadians in Canada, in which 67% of that 300,000 Canadians are between the ages of 0 to 14 years old. which means 2/3 of the Somali Canadians that call Canada home are less than 25 years old. And growing up here, I see a lot of young people with no, mostly growing up in a single mother home with no role models to help them out. And they divided into two, joining a gang and ending up being shot in the streets of Fort McMurray in Alberta, as we had 29, one ethnic, 29 young boys lost in Alberta in just 6 months. And nothing has been done from the federal government side. And it's only one community. It never happened that except the native Indians. So we have that group, and then the second group is young Somalis saying, okay, instead of joining gang and end up in the streets dead, I might as well run to the, to religion. And that's when they run to religion that has been taken advantage of by some radicals.
Okay, a number of things to follow up there. Imam, the run to religion. Why would there be this lure? For example, if you weren't born in Somalia, you're born here. Maybe your parents or grandparents are from there, but you're from here. Why the lure to the mother country? Why the lure to that, that fundamentalist interpretation of the religion? Where does that come from?
I believe there's two elements here. Number one is that a perverted understanding of the religious texts. And number two is perceived victimization. Many of these youth who are coming or born here, but they have immigrant parents, what's happening is that there's Islamophobia out there, there's racial profiling out there. They're going through difficult circumstances, situations, and they're looking, as the individual said here, Mohammed, that they want to get back to their country, and they're looking
but
at
this is their country, isn't it?
I understand that, but they want to link back to their hometowns. So what they're doing is they feel the pain of the people there, and many times they don't know how to vent that anger. So what they're doing is they're manipulating the religious texts for their objectives, and now that thought process, how I mentioned earlier, it now becomes a crime, it becomes an action, it becomes violent. So these are two main elements that I believe is causing radicalization within the community.
Michelle, could you help us with that? How do people in a position of authority, for example, here, exploit first or second generation Canadians and this lure that they apparently feel to their parents' or grandparents' home country?
I totally second what just been shared. In that perspective, very often the second and the third generation have a certain romanticized perspective of what the country is about, what their roots are about, what their origin are about. This is sort of emphasized by the fact that, yes, in some cases, particularly if they are part of a visible minority, they will sort of experience occasionally some pressure coming from the system, particularly after there is incidents here in Canada or abroad. If there was to be another cells found in the US or in Europe, and there is news, there is sort of a little wave, a ripple that comes to Canada when they try to take the plane or when they try to sort of find a job or something like this. These are consequences that they suffer right here that comes occasionally from abroad and will be exploited by some radical thinkers. Some people, some extremists who can be found not necessarily in their own town. Some are found right here in Canada, but some can be found right there on the internet. These young people are very agile with the communication device. They're capable to go on the internet as they wish, and they will listen. They will listen, they will see those videos, they will listen to those texts, and again, with this sort of own understanding of what the Quran is about, then it sort of go the wrong way. There's somewhere an emotion. It's not like crime. It's not like organized crime or street gangs and everything. There's a portion of anger, a portion of frustration, but there's also a sense of business. We're there to make money. Terrorism is totally different. It's pure rage, it's pure anger and frustration, and somehow needs to be channeled through some activities.
Mohammed, a follow-up?
Yeah, I was just let me put a thought about when I asked a young man, why would you be so angry to a country, that you were born? A young Somali, a couple of them, we had a coffee one time, and they basically told me, listen, we were told what society society told us to be a good citizen, stay out of trouble, don't be a gang member, don't sell drugs. We did. Stay in high school because they are black and they should be, most of them grew up in a government housing areas. So they said majority of their friends are not even graduating high school. So they say stay in the school, be a good citizen. And after they graduate high school, if you can go to college, perfect. If you can go to university, get a degree. Look at us, they said. How many can you see? And there was a bunch of them. And all of them are university graduates. What are we doing? We're all security guards and taxi drivers. That was acceptable to our parents, but is not acceptable to us.
So if I hear you right, there's something about the Canadian dream unfulfilled that you think is pushing some people towards this path.
When that anger, when a young man plays by the law and achieves something, and he doesn't have any role model or anybody to help him out, to give him to the next stage, and he is very frustrated and angry, and a radical comes to him and say, hey, do you know why you didn't get the job? I was told that. You know why you don't get a job? I have 2 degrees and I'm working security guard.
That's your situation.
That's my situation. Perfect example right here.
What degrees do you have?
I have a political science degree from Brock and I got 93% average. I got scholarship to the Harvard of the Pacific at Bonn University in Australia. I did law school there. I worked for NATO. I worked for the UN. I was in charge for last year a major exercise that was done in NATO headquarters where a 3rd Canadian general, the 3rd man in the Canadian Army, Major General David Fraser, flew from Canada to learn from our exercise in which I designed it. And you're not from the civilian part. And he came, he was told by a brigadier from British, General Brigadier Paddy Allison, I want to thank a Somali Canadian who was, I was in the British Defence Academy in central UK. And I was giving speeches and trying to explain the exercise that we were doing at that time.
Okay, but just so I'm clear, you're not blaming the recession on the fact that you're a security guard, you're blaming something else.
No, it's not, I'm not blaming nobody. For me, I can get contracts and job and work anywhere in the world, but not in my country, not in Canada. Okay. And that's why when radicals come to you and say, do you know why? Because your name is Mohammed, you're not wanted, you're Muslim, you will never get a chance in this country. These young men who are unemployed with the university degrees in the mosques or even in the neighborhoods doing nothing, what do? They turn to YouTube and listen to this YouTube and to this propaganda
the call
media.
For jihad.
Yeah,
okay, let me follow up with Jonathan on that because you've raised some interesting points here. Jonathan, the immigrant experience in your country and particularly in ours is a well-known story that's been well documented over the past 100+ years. Most of the time, immigrants love to come to Canada. They make a new life for themselves. It's a good story. Can you help us understand, either through your experiences in London or from what you understand to be the case here, whether there is something different about the Muslim immigrant experience or the Somali immigrant experience or something that would perhaps help explain what's been going on here?
Well, I think first of all, you can't really compare the Muslim immigration to the UK with Muslim immigration to Canada. Muslim immigration to the UK stems from post-World War II. It was mainly people filling in parts of the economy that are lower wage, skilled jobs, whereas Canadian Muslim immigration has been completely different. It's much more recent. The immigrants who are going there are much more highly, they have better qualifications. So I think you can't necessarily just say Muslim immigration and then without kind of following up on those differences. But I did want to make the point about the lure. And I think one thing that I agree with a lot of what was said, especially frustration that young people feel. But one thing I didn't hear, and what our research found, was that young people were also really attracted that the idea of Al-Qaeda, of going abroad, was it was youthful rebellion, it was romantic, it was countercultural. So to that extent, people tend to emphasize the religious element, but I think the youthful element is also extremely important. The second point, I think, is in our research in Canada, we saw a lot of condemnation about people wanting to do any kind of attack in Canada. But with respect to people in Canada traveling abroad, that was a much more difficult gray area where people would say, I wouldn't advocate it, but I'm not going to condemn it. I think their motives are right. So I think that gray area is maybe sending mixed messages to people.
Imam Badat.
Yes, I just want to substantiate from a study that I came across, and this is done by the Duke University and University of North Carolina. The title of it is Anti-Terror Lessons for Muslim Americans. And they did a thorough study, and here I have a document that says findings: increased anti-Muslim bias. Since 9/11, there has been increased tension amongst Muslim Americans about their acceptance in mainstream American society. Muslim Americans perceive a stronger anti-Muslim bias from both their day-to-day interactions and the media. And you know, I can read on, and it talks about this. This is just the executive summary.
But is there something different about the Muslim experience? Because, you know, pretty much every single immigrant group that's come to Canada has been discriminated against, whether it was the Italians from 60 years ago, the Jews, whatever. Whoever came here from somewhere else had to suffer discrimination before they felt more a part of society. But none of those other groups, to the best of my knowledge, have the kind of experiences with, you know, launching jihad against the country in which they have adopted. What's different about the Muslim experience that they do that? Not
Well,
they, some do.
Right. Well, I do see that, and I've read about the history of immigrants in this country. You know, it's our turn, but at the same time, we do see, you know, mainstream media, you know, basically sensationalizing these people who are doing these kind of things. I'm going to refer to another report here.
You've come prepared today. You've done
Yes.
your homework.
I'm going to look at the Toronto Star, an article. Why do these people do this? And in the Toronto Star, it's mentioned that Michael King, a McGill University PhD student, he says here that news reports that glorify or sensationalize terrorist plots only helps to recruit others. The media, he continues, he says, I'm quoting, the media might play a role in helping radicalize others by taking these goofy cases, you know, it's only alleged, but it's already on mainstream and people have made the judgment. And then he says, and using words like operatives, covertly trying to do this or that. And he says, adding a more serious, sinister, cool, more glamorizing image, that is what is radicalizing the youth.
Let me put that to Michelle for a second, because, okay, in a lot of those cases, Michelle, it's simply media quoting law enforcement officials, and I wonder whether there is, you know, is there something to what the Imam has to say here?
Well, I think I want to be careful when we sort of point the fingers in all directions, and we've got to look at our society as a block as well. Basically, what we're currently facing as an entire world, the entire society, is we've got a certain group of people who have a wrong interpretation, a pervert interpretation of holy words. They use that in order to sort of radicalize some discourses that are distributed on the internet, and will eventually, and I do not discard, on the contrary, I do not discard the frustration and some of the challenges that our youth are facing. But these challenges and are not necessarily different than any youth in any society, to a certain extent, that looks different than the majority that is around him. And I think it is a challenge for all society to try to sort of recuperate those young people, offer them some model, offer them some future of a kind or another. And somewhere, somehow, the responsibility that we have also from another perspective is collectively the Western world has to tackle the issue of terrorism at the source, not only at the symptoms. What we're talking about here, to a certain extent, is not the source of terrorism, it's the symptoms. It's the symptom, and despite the great success of arresting a cell and eventually bringing some people to court, this, again, is only treating the symptom. We must sort of return to the source, the cause of terrorism, why these people are so angry, why they organize themselves eventually to sort of launch attack the way they have been doing so. And by neutralizing this element, we will sort of neutralize a lot of the issue that we are currently talking about. So I think it's a question of asking, like I said, I don't want to diminish the challenges that we have to take care of our youth right here, immigrant or not, or sons and daughters of immigrant or not. All the youth are facing quite a huge challenge, but at the same time, like I said, not missing the point about where terrorism is coming from and what are the root cause, because when we understand the root cause, then we can find the real solutions.
Okay, but Mubin, I haven't heard from you in a bit, and I appreciate the Imam's point about the media and the role it may play in kind of fomenting something here. But is there something in Islam itself? I understand the kind of perverted interpretation of Islam that Michel describes, but do you think there is something broader in Islam itself that contributes to this?
Well, I wanna still piggyback off of what Michel was saying, and there's a reason why it's called intelligence. I mean, the point is right. Look at the grievances. Okay, that's one aspect of it. And when you ask the question, what is within Islam that's making people do this, I would call that the mechanism. So what we see is, look, on the good side, Islam is a religion, a way of life that many people subscribe to. It is noted to be the fastest growing religion in North America and Western countries, not necessarily by birth rate, but the conversion rates are pretty high. My friends here can also tell us about converts that are being used. Muhammad knows very well about converts to Islam who have come from the US, black, Spanish, you name it, they're there. So there is a lot of good that is in Islam. But if it is unbridled, then it can become very destructive. And linking back to grievances, look, we have to admit, I mean, this is not apologizing for anybody, this is just observing the reality. When we have boots on the ground in countries, and Michael King from McGill had mentioned this also, but others know this also, when you have boots on the ground in other countries, you're going to have the kind of blowback. Blowback is inevitable. And
we just got to expect that.
And that is the natural progression. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, cause and effect. So we cannot divorce that from the discourse also. We have to look at all these things together. And just a final point I want to hammer a little bit on the ideology and the community. We have these kids who are not looking into nonviolent means, looking into more constructive means. What I have found in the community, my own community, is that you have this understanding, especially among really religious types, that participation in a non-Muslim country, to them is anathema. And this doesn't make sense to me. I go on the rule of Canada is the most just country in the world. Even Sweden has banned minarets, okay? So they've lost their status. Canada is the best country in the world, the most just.
For anybody or for Muslims in
I'm saying
particular?
for anybody. For anybody. And so for the Muslim to make the accusation, make the argument that Canada somehow qualifies as one of those quote-unquote tyrannical, oppressive countries against whom armed jihad is warranted is totally false.
But is that because we got troops in Afghanistan?
Well, it plays a part. It does play a part. We can't avoid that, right? Alliances to the United States, Canada's role in NATO, these things make Canada a target not just for Islamic jihadists, but also, I mean, just your regular old espionage, right?
Okay, let me follow up with Jonathan on this one. The notion of a radical becoming a violent radical. How does that happen? There are lots of people in our society who have radical views, but they don't want to go around beheading politicians. What moves someone from a radical to a violent radical?
Well, actually, I think it's an interesting assumption in your question that being radical is the first step to becoming a violent radical. And actually, what our research would show is that actually they're kind of different things. You can hold radical views and be completely against violence, particularly in the West and against civilians. And that's why I think we need to be clear about what we mean by a perverted, and be very specific about what we mean by a perverted version of Islam. Because what we found is even fundamentalist strands or radical groups, they were not first step on a path. The violent individuals is almost a completely different phenomenon, and actually shared more in common with other subversive groups of predominantly angry young men like gangs, in the sense of it was the group dynamic, it was peer pressure, it was internal codes of honor tied to a culture of violence. These were the things that were integral into the turn to violence. So not necessarily having radical views.
Mohammed, you want to follow on that?
For example, in law, it says there's two parts, the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. In the Quran, it's the exact same thing. Some of the young people, they use some of these radicals, they use some quotes without explaining the whole picture. Mm-hmm. For example, in the Quran, it says, if attacked by the enemy in your country or your home, or you get killed and your family got killed, you can do the same they did to you. But there are also other explanations. So they use they pick and choose the ones they need to convince this young mind. On the other hand, when Michel, I respect him a lot, when Mr. Michel said that every youth goes through this program, this, I mean, change of, I mean, problems with all the youth and stuff like that, I'll tell him that we are different. Read it from me. We are different.
Who's
and
we here?
The youth, Muslim youth, we are different, and I'll tell you why.
Different from other youth in the country?
Yes.
How so?
Before I was introduced to Islam, I was a Muslim, but I was not religious until I went to university. That's when I was really was educated in my religion. But I used to pray and all that stuff, but when I went to university, that's when the first Islamic Awareness Week of the Muslim Student Association of every university we have in this country, that's when I really had an intelligentsia, Islamic intelligentsia, going for the young, fresh mind that are coming to the educated areas. So the reason I tell Michelle we are different is there's an enemy more powerful as NATO, Al-Qaeda, more money than Canada. I mean, NATO couldn't defeat it for 10 years in Afghanistan. They have resources from the Gulf that want us, the young Muslims, to fight for their cause in the Western world. The reason we're different is because that big organization called Al-Qaeda is desperate to find young Muslim Westerners, born and bred, who can fit in and do their job for them, compared to a black or a white Christian Canadian. I mean, there's no money out there, there's no resources. Al-Qaeda is putting resources, a lot of resources to recruit us young people.
So you're targeted in a way that others are not.
Yes,
That's
we
part
have
of
a
it.
lot of pressure.
Okay, let me go to Michelle on that, because your former organization, CSIS, says that it is tracking about 200 individuals with possible links to terror groups. There's nothing to indicate that all of those people are Muslims, and there are 1 million Muslims in Canada today. So if you do the math, is the threat of sort of Muslim homegrown terror exaggerated?
Not necessarily exaggerated in terms that the 200 people, and thank you very much, Mohammed, for the precision, but the 200 people that CSIS is currently following is terrorists, all color, all size, all across the board. We're talking the Sikh, the Tamil, the Irish, the Croats, name it. These are the 200 people that are of interest for CSIS currently, that are sort of promoting or linked to some radical movement, i.e. terrorist. When it comes to Islamic terrorism, it's even smaller, much smaller in that perspective. The challenge is there. But when I go back into on my experience in the 30 years that I've been in the field, I recall two significant experiences that I had. When I was a young RCMP officer 30 years ago, I remember going to high school and speaking with young people in northeast Caraquet in New Brunswick, and they were scared, they were afraid of the future, and they were facing exactly the same frustration and challenges, and they were depressed about what the future held for them. And that was way early in the 80s. And later on, I was in charge of monitoring also right-wing extremists, neo-Nazi, white supremacists. And the way they were recruiting people were, again, the same perspective. Young people who felt defranchised, the people who felt abandoned, people who didn't have any role model, who found suddenly a group they could belong to, a group that felt sort of a family for them that they didn't have somewhere else, somewhere that was giving them a perspective of society that was very sort of black and white, no pun intended, black and white in terms of being easy to read, easy to understand. So the challenges for young Muslim here or young Islamic people here, yeah, there is certainly some challenges right there. But what is interesting is when we look, particularly if we take the study of the last group, they have not been recruited by scouts that were out there to try to find those radical young minds. They have not been recruited necessarily by imam perverting the holy words of the Quran in order to sort of find those young people. They actually recruited themselves, if I may say, by radicalizing themselves intellectually. They are young, bright people. They see some on justice going on. They see some historical incident that took place, and we are not correcting it. We're not doing it. We're even sort of in the Western world, sort of using them to a certain extent to our own advantage. And until the Western world does something to really sort of change things and gives a chance to the moderate to take sort of the upper hand over the radicals, the radicals will still have the microphone and will still be capable to promote through the internet.
Well, that's
and
a
then
good place
those
to
young
go.
people will find that.
That's a good place to go. Let me follow up. Imam, what are you doing, for example, to get that target off the back of the young people who apparently are being targeted by Al-Qaeda?
Right. As imams and community leaders, since 9/11, we've been doing a lot. Unfortunately, we're not getting the publicity. To give you a practical example, we've had the RCMP Citizens Academy at our mosques, at our organizations, where we try to build bridges with the authorities to understand what they're doing and what's happened, what's our responsibility. Number two, as imams, we've made statements again and again. Just most recently, at the beginning of Ramadan, less than 3-4 weeks ago, the Imam Council, we came up with a statement with 7 practical points denouncing all forms of violence and all forms of terrorism.
How effective and influential do you think all this has been?
Yeah, so those people, I bank on the Michelle's point, yeah, that there are people that are self-radicalizing themselves, whereas our statements may not have an impact. But we are doing whatever we can, into our capacity. One thing you have to understand, as an imam, we got tremendous responsibilities. We're teaching, we're performing marriages, we're delivering the sermons. We don't work for the state. Many times we don't have, the resources. So, our hands are tied many times.
I understand and appreciate that,
Yes.
but can you tell in your own congregation, for example, who's being targeted?
No, to tell you the truth, for example, my mosque where I lead the prayers and deliver the sermons, we have 3,000 people every Friday. Now, I rub shoulders with them, I meet with them, I talk to them, and the doctor. This is a practical example. It's alleged, however, he's a doctor. He was on Canadian Idol. He was part of the society. He's done social work. How can I tell? How can you tell if you were the imam? How can you tell that this is the one that's going to be a potential terrorist? So, we don't have a magic wand. We don't have a crystal ball. However, we're doing whatever we can to explain the right understanding of Islam and to be there to mentor them. If they have a concern, we're there to mentor them, to guide them.
Let me follow up with Jonathan on that. What ideas are you looking at in London, UK, to try to get the target off the backs of those young people who are being targeted by Al-Qaeda for a violent future?
Well, in the UK, obviously this is an issue of the highest priority. And following the 7/7 attacks, the government released this quite a comprehensive counterterrorism strategy called Contest. And there are 4 elements to that. The most, with respect to this question, Prevent was the most, in a sense, controversial element, and it's currently being reviewed at the moment. Because what it did was, it was a whole-of-government approach that included targeted interventions with individuals who were considering violence, trying to challenge the violent ideology, trying to confront radical preachers, but also trying to deal with underlying grievances. And what the problem was with this was that it ended up creating this sense that the entire Muslim community in the UK was suspect. And so you had all these social policy areas and priorities, community cohesion, immigration, integration, all those got sucked in to countering terrorism. And what happened was the Muslim community felt that the government was only willing to engage with them through this prism of countering terrorism. And non-Muslim communities were looking at the Muslim community and saying, look at them, they're getting all this resources only because of the threat to terrorism. So I think Canada can learn a lot from the UK in terms of not taking a whole-of-government approach.
Mubin, you wanted to say.
Yes, just to follow up with what Jonathan was saying about the government response and government programs, the UK has invested a lot of financial resources into this. Australia, Denmark, many countries in Europe, but Canada is really, even the United States of course, but Canada has no program, no funding. that's a problem. Another problem, and I got to pick on CSIS and the RCMP just a little bit. I really don't believe they're doing enough. You know, true, they have done quite a bit, to be fair. They've done, I think, what is beyond what a lot of intelligence agencies would have done. In the cases of some of these young radicalized kids, they actually went to the homes of these kids, talked to the parents saying, listen, your kid is involved in this. Maybe showing them a little...
The authorities did this.
Yes, the authorities did this, especially in the Toronto 18 case. You know, the community is generally not aware of this, but the fact that CSIS did that, I give them a lot of credit for that. I don't think there's any place, certainly not in the Muslim world, where the intelligence agencies are going to come to you and say, hey, you know, if you just look at this paper here, that's not how it works over there. So we'll give them credit there. But there needs to be a little bit more, and you know, maybe Michelle can go into that a little bit. Coming back to the RCMP, look, the Citizens Academy is not going to convince the community. It seems to be a recruiting stall for the RCMP. And having dealt with the RCMP very intimately, I'm not really convinced that the RCMP has is really honest about working truly with the communities. I can look back in a few years, in the past few years, they played maybe a couple of soccer games with some youth organizations. That's not enough. It's one thing to demand of Muslims and Muslim imams that, look, you got to find the terrorists, right? But, I mean, the authorities really, and since it's their job, I think they can do more by having powers, a little bit more, to be able to monitor the internet. If we're filtering child pornography off of those things, why can't we put, you know, jihadist sites in those same categories? So
let me ask Michelle to respond to not only that, but also the notion that how does an imam who has 3,000 people coming to his mosque every week,
Right,
yeah, I mean, how do they keep an eye on 3,000 people? I mean, this is a pretty tough job.
Well, the problem is that the most radical one will probably not go to his mosque because he's not hearing what he wants to hear. He needs validation, he needs reinforcement of his radical thoughts, and it's not where he's going to find it, unfortunately. He's going to probably go to the legal mosques that are popping up left and right, who some, not all, some radical imam are preaching sort of the wrong perspective. And that's where he's going to get the reinforcement that he's seeking for. When it comes to sort of turn towards CSIS or the RCMP to try to sort of be part of the solution or actively involved in trying to sort of help the youth, they might have, and that's what we used to call community policing, they might have a little bit of work, but it's not really their job. It's not really their job. I think their job, the job must come from the community, and in that perspective, the government somewhere has to bring a certain leadership by bringing a certain vision that must come again from the population. I love this popular saying in English that actions speak louder than words, and somewhere this is what the young, the youth are seeking for. They are seeking for action, somewhere something that is constructive. But we are starting with a huge problem. When Mohammed was talking about the problem that there is in his own community where the young men do not have any role model at home, that's a huge problem. That's a huge, huge, huge problem. And right there, we are asking, and it's a phenomenal task, we're asking the community leader to try to fill up that vacuum, that gap that exists within the community. But again, I think that what needs to be done is that somewhere, somehow, a grand scan, a grand perspective, a big picture with a vision where we can sort of come and bring some very constructive element rather than sort of leaving these people. But this is as big as the problem that we have in some of the gangs that we have in the streets of the major cities. How do we sort of pull those young people out of those gangs? It's a huge phenomenon. It's a huge problem.
From the Somali perspective, for example, in Toronto, we have about 100,000 Somali Canadians that call Toronto home. 0 Toronto Police Services. Not a single Somali police officer. Why?
Let me ask a logical question. Do Somalis want to serve on the Toronto Police Force?
In Ottawa, which we have 10 or 20,000 Somali communities, we have 2 police officers.
So my question stands. Do they want to serve on the force?
Of course they do.
They do.
But
they're not on because why?
Why? Because there's certain programs that are preventing it. For example, the $500 enrollment fee is too much for the young people. They can't afford it. Remember, every year in Toronto, we have about 400 to 500 young Somalis graduating university and college. And as I said, 95, in Canada, it's 8%. They're saying 8% unemployment rate. In the Somali community, the youth is 95% unemployment.
How do you know that?
I'm part of the youth. I lived with the youth. I grew up here. I went to university. I graduated. I go back to them right now, and it's 95% doing nothing.
Okay.
No job. And it comes, I wanted to raise the point that Michelle said, we need the community leaders to come and help us. First of all, and to the Imam can't do everything. The young generation, you can read the Quran you want, they don't understand because it's Arabic to them. But the Al-Qaeda, what they're using, the biggest recruiter of the young Somalis in Canada is an American-born Abu Mansour al-Amriki. But he lived about 2 buildings away from where I live right now. He worked there. He marries a Somali Canadian, have a Canadian child that lives here in Canada today. What does he do to recruit? He makes R&B hip-hop. He says, like one of his best songs, that if I walk today back to the community, I see young kids singing, saying, blow by blow, one well-known. It's day by day, night by night, Mujahideen is spreading all over the place. Hour by hour, minute by minute, we keep the Kafirs living in fear. And there's a new song, the new videotape that just came back about a week ago. And it's called From Mogadishu to Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem. And he's singing to the young Muslims to come, especially young Somalis. He's not quoting Quran at all. He's speaking English, R&B, hip-hop, and he's talking to the young Canadians. He's saying, come and join me. You're my brothers. Love you all, my Muslim brothers. He ends like that.
Mubin?
Yeah, I just want to, just specifically on this point of recruitment, online recruitment, the use of these YouTube videos, social networking sites, speaking the language that they speak. And you know, we're in a battle for hearts and minds. We keep saying that, right? We've been saying that for years and years. We use that slogan to support our Canadian forces overseas. But I mean, what are we actually doing to win the battle of hearts and minds? And like Mohammed is saying, how is it that you know, they can produce a video like that within an hour, and it'll be up in half that time, less than a quarter of that time. In a few minutes, it'll be uploaded. I don't see how I think a product that needs to come out is a counter message, a counter video. So I think to understand this dynamic, how the recruitment occurs, speaking the language that they speak, and then using that, exploiting that, and then producing a new product. I think that's one possible solution that we should look into. So I just wanted to add to that.
Okay, let me just, because we only got about 5 minutes and change left to go here, and I want to cover a couple of more things. Imam, I think we have sympathy for your position. You have 300 people in your congregation every week, 3,000, excuse me, and of course you can't keep an eye on everybody and know what's going on. But yours is a legal, well-established community. We've also heard that there are illegal mosques where much more radical elements are taking place. Is there anything we can do about those?
Well, there is no study to prove what you have said. In fact,
I'm just quoting other people on the program here.
The Duke study that I presented earlier, I'm gonna refer to it once again. The Duke University's Sanford School of Public Policy and the University of North Carolina study, Anti-Terror Lessons of American Muslims.
Okay, I'm going to stop you right there.
Published January 2010. Just one sentence.
But I don't want the American situation. I want to know about here in Ontario.
I'm going to link it up to the Canadian.
Okay.
American mosques are a deterrent to the spread of militant Islam and terrorism.
American mosques are a
American mosques are a deterrent
How about Canadian
to the
mosques?
spread of militant Islam and terrorism. Now, there are much more Muslims in the millions in America. We are a smaller group here. And we can relate to the study because the setup is very similar. Our culture, our lifestyle is very similar. And you know, we have, as Mubin said, we have boots there. They have boots there. Okay, the alliance is there. So there is no study that is proving that mosques or prayer spaces are a recruiting space. Yes, is it possible? It can be.
I'm not sure the comparison works, though. They're the melting pot, we're the mosaic. It's a kind of a completely different approach to organizing a society. I'm not sure the Duke study helps.
The officer said earlier that they don't hear what they want to hear in the mosques. So they go on YouTube, they go on social service websites, and they self-radicalize.
Okay, let me get from Jonathan here for a second. Jonathan, how about we heard a moment ago Mubin talk about how do you win the hearts and minds. So talk to the non-Muslim community, if you would, right now, and tell them how they can help lower the probability of Muslim homegrown terror in their neighborhoods.
The non-Muslim community.
Yes.
Well, I think it goes back to the point about Islamophobia that we saw before. I mean, I think, because media reports tend to focus on counterterrorism, especially in the UK, you're seeing a breakdown of relations between communities. And I think really what it takes is just simple interactions in everyday spaces between non-Muslim people and Muslim people, because in the end of the day, that's just one construction of identity. People have religion, they have, their nationality, what kind of music they like, many different types in which to identify themselves. And I think we need to increase interactions between different types of people, and through that, then learn that, break down these barriers and learn that these people are just, they're not that different, despite what the media, perceptions of what the media creates.
Mubin, does that make sense to you?
No, it does. I like that. You know what? Just go out and talk to a Muslim. Same thing for a Muslim. Talk to the non-Muslim. Don't think that everyone's out to kill you and everyone's out to get you. But I want to return back on what do we do with these mosques, back alley mosques, garage mosques. And both Michelle and Imam Badal were saying about the established mosque is not going to recruit radicals. You will not see radicalization going on there. When I was operational, I went to many, many mosques in the city, and never once did I hear anything that even remotely resembled criminal extremism. I think what we need to do is, again, go back to the law. Canada is the most just country in the world. The overwhelming majority of larger organizations, they have to go through a vetting process. They're responsible for their assets are responsible. They're responsible to the law, to the government, for their organizations. I think what we need to do is to focus on this, and that where organizations just, if people are talking like this, either revoke their licenses and don't even give them licenses in the first place. Charitable organizations, again, Canada is the most just country. We have tax-free status, the places of worship. When people start to talk against the country that feeds them, if you're going to bite the hand that feeds you, prepare to be muzzled.
Mohammed, I'd like to give you some more time to follow up on that, but I haven't got any. We're right out of time. But I want to thank everybody for coming on the program tonight and discussing something that we know has perplexed and exercised the Canadian public for a very long time right now. Jonathan Birdwell, a researcher at Demos, the leading British think tank over in London, UK. Jonathan, thanks so much for being there on the line for us. Michel Junot-Katsuya, the former CSIS operative, security and intelligence specialist for the Northgate Group. Michel, always good to have you on the line from our nation's capital as well. Here in our studio, from left to right, Imam Sheikh Yusuf Badat from the Islamic Foundation of Toronto, Mohammed Abdullahi Mohammed, and we are hopeful, given your resume that you put out there earlier, that you can get a better job than what you've got right now, because I think you probably would like to do better, right?
God bless
Amen
Canada.
to that. Okay, and easy fast for the rest of Ramadan to you. Mubin Sheikh, former CSIS undercover informant in the Toronto 18 terror case. Grateful to all of you for participating in tonight's program. Thanks so much.